micromobility in general as a sector really thrived in the past few years based on one big observation is that cars have become a suboptimal way to move around cities for many reasons.
Welcome to Revolution.
Thanks a lot, Elisa, for the intro, and happy to talk about my experience in micromobility and well, how I see the sector evolving over the next few months and few years. Please feel free to interrupt me if you want to ask a question, if you have a comment, don't hesitate to do so. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. Okay, I'll start with a quick presentation about myself. So I was born in Morocco, grew up between France and Morocco, and studied in France. I started my career in consulting for a few years, then joined Uber in early 2015. My first role at Uber was an international launcher, so we'd basically be sent to new market to set up the entity, recruit the team, and initiate the business until a certain scale, and then I would transition in out to the local team. So I've done that in Egypt, in Morocco. I've launched different business units in Singapore and Malaysia, and around that time, that was back in 2017. There was the emergence of new models of mobility. What we call today micromobility is basically short trips, short distances, and the first among the first operators in this area were companies called Ofo, Mobike. I don't know if you guys heard of them, but they basically started in China as mobility operators, and they started expanding to international markets in 2017. So I was one of the first employees at Ofo in Europe. I joined them as a regional manager for Southern Europe, based out of Spain. That was a great experience, first because it was my first experience in the micromobility sector, and I was discovering the free floating model. It was really in the early days. Like in every industry, it was a very difficult beginning for many reasons. There was some issues with the product market fit. The bikes were breaking a lot. They were not electric, and I was operating markets that can be very hilly. So users were quite unhappy with were often quite unhappy with the service. But still, we really saw like a big increase in usage, because like it really solved the problem. I think the approach with which he was taking the problem was probably not the most appropriate, but it was, at least the problem was there, identified, and it led the way for other operators to thrive. A year after I joined Ofo actually was going through some issues with their investors in China. They were trying to reform the company, but the company was losing a lot of money. They basically raised massive rounds of fundings, but they were not able to sustain a profitable business. So they basically went out of business after a year, and they really exposed one of the main issues of micromobility, which is unit economics, and I'm going to talk more about it a bit later. So a year after joining Ofo, I joined Scoot Networks, which is actually probably the first micromobility company, or the first free floating service. I see Michael Keating is also in the audience, so he can probably confirm it. But I think they started back in 2012 in SF with mopeds, and they're probably the very first operator in this area. So Scoot had a very different approach from Ofo. One, it was working a lot more closely with cities. So instead of launching cities without asking for authorizations or getting a license to operate, they would really work hand in hand with the cities before launching any vehicles. So they would be granted permits, they would be granted official authorizations before getting into the city, which made them really successful in the cities where they operated. Among those cities, so there was San Francisco, where they had both a moped and scooter service. They were one of the two operators who got the scooter license. They were also operating in Barcelona, where they had a multimodal fleet of e-bikes and mopeds. Scoot got acquired by Bird in summer 2019. Um, Bird is a US based scooter sharing operator based out of LA, Santa Monica. Um, so Bird saw a lot of interest in acquiring Scoot for many reasons. One is they had, because of those excellent relationships that Scoot had with cities, and because of licenses that Scoot had won in some key cities like San Francisco and Barcelona, and where Bird was not able to secure permits, that was a great way to enter those markets. And that's also like a trend that we've seen in the industry, a consolidation trend where bigger player would acquire smaller players to access a specific market. So that was reason number one. Reason number two is Scoot was one of, if not the only multimodal mobility company, and Bird really wanted to break into the moped and bike sharing services. They were only operating scooters, so they wanted to learn how to operate scooters and mopeds and bikes. And because of its experience, Scoot was very attractive to Bird. And when Scoot was acquired, I was offered the position of GM at Bird in France. So I moved to France in summer 2019, and I led the market here for over a year before leaving Bird in January this year and starting a new mobility company around e-bikes. So that's the company I'm working on at the moment. It's called Bloom. I'm quickly gonna talk about it, then we can get more into like the presentation itself. Bloom is an e-bike subscription service. So the idea is quite simple. For a monthly fee, we ship or we send an e-bike, a high-end and premium e-bike to our users. They get access to a certain number of services, maintenance, insurance, and concierge. And the third pillar, which is essential to the service, is the product. So it's a connected bike. It's a smart bike where you can gather some data about your usage. You can share the bike with other members of the community, and you can also locate your bike through your app. So that's a project I'm working on at the moment. Let's talk a bit more about micromobility. So micromobility in general as a sector really thrived in the past few years based on one big observation, is that cars have become a suboptimal way to move around cities for many reasons. Number one, cars take a lot of space. A car doesn't move for 90% of the time. So it's just occupying some really scarce city real estate. So for instance, in Paris, 60% of the real estate is dedicated to cars, which is just a huge amount of real estate, knowing all the lodging and all the lodging issues we have here in Paris. It's obviously the number one source of congestion in most of the cities. So every year we estimate that countries lose up to 4% of their GDP due to congestion. Because of this congestion, traffic is now extremely slow in big cities like New York and London. So for instance, in London, the average traffic speed is 8 kilometers per hour, which is the same same speed as horses back in the previous century. So the cities are starting to take a lot of actions in reducing the number of cars they have on the streets. So for instance, in Europe, Paris is trying to achieve or are trying to build the biggest network of bike lanes by the end of 2021. Milan has also been working very hard during the different lockdowns to implement some ambitious schemes for more bike lanes. We see the same in London, Madrid. So all the big cities are really working hard to improve the cycling infrastructure through physical infrastructure, but also through subsidies. And they're also like putting new restrictions on cars. So for instance, in Madrid, you cannot access the city center if you have a combustion engine car. All right. So having said that, let's talk a bit more about what is the evolution of micromobility and how it started. So micromobility appeared in Europe back in the 90s with the first bike sharing schemes that appeared in Northern Europe. So for instance, in Paris, sorry, in Denmark, I think that the first bike sharing system dates back to 95. Then a lot of cities followed on this trend and launched their own bike sharing system. So all of those bike sharing systems are dock based, so it requires a physical infrastructure to operate. So for instance, in Paris in 27, the city of Paris launched Velib, which is an extremely successful and high network bike scheme system. The problem with the system is that it has not been usually profitable for many reasons. One is that they depend a lot on city subsidies. They're highly subsidized as businesses. That's why they're so cheap, because they want most people to be able to access those services, and also because there are some stations that need to be built. And they are expensive to be built. They take some precious real estate space, and they're hard to maintain. And also because the bikes are non-standard, they have a high touch level of service required, and they need constant rebalancing to make sure that the whole system is efficient. So make sure that during peak hours you have available bikes in the specific areas, and that you're able to return the bikes in some specific areas at the end of the day. So that was the first, let's say, schemes that were launched in the 90s. But because of all these inefficiencies and because of this difficulty to make it profitable as a service, some private operators have started thinking about other ways to operate bike sharing systems, and it has coincided with the emergence and let's say the democratization of smartphones, and that's how operators in China has launched free floating services. So they basically took this idea of using your phone and using your GPS to locate a bike, and they deployed it to an extreme, with like thousands and thousands of bikes that they would acquire and just deploy on the streets. And the idea behind it is that the more bikes you have and the more ubiquitous your services, the more users you'll get, because basically you become the number one service, and you always have a bike around you. And the problem with this kind of approach is that, one, you're burning a lot of cash in acquiring your vehicles. Two, your vehicles are not always well suited to this kind of usage, so it's an intensive use. So they break a lot, so it costs you a lot of money to maintain your fleet, and it also costs you a lot of money to make sure that your fleet is perfectly positioned at all times. So that was kind of the second step, or the second big era in this micromobility industry. The third one is more recent and actually started in the US with the scooter operators. So Bird was the first scooter operator to launch in LA, in California, in 2017. So Bird was the main idea behind Bird is that, one, there is something going on with electrification. So light electric vehicles are becoming cheaper and cheaper for many reasons. One of the reasons being that the batteries themselves, the battery costs have been divided by 2 just in the last 10 years. So it has become a lot cheaper to buy and operate a fleet of electric scooters. And number 2 is that people are really looking for ways to cover their short trip distances. So Uber and all the ride-sharing companies are really offering a great value prop for longer distances, so anything above 2 miles. But this sweet spot between 0 and 2 miles is not really targeted, and that's where micromobility is thriving, and that's how Bird and other competitors that have followed have decided to approach the market. So there are like 5 main categories of micromobility. I'm not going to spend so much time on this one, but as I said, the sweet spot for scooters and e-bike and bikes is 2 mile, and then once you go past those 2 miles, e-bikes are the perfect way to move around the city, and then you'll have mopeds and heavier vehicles after that. So there's one thing that has appeared, and that is a trend that we can notice in the sector, is that most operators today are trying to become multimodal because they've all realized that one vehicle doesn't fit and doesn't answer all the needs for all the users. So for instance, for very short trips, scooters will be a great response, but once you get over 2-3 miles, then scooters become a bit less comfortable, and maybe there's some batteries issues, so e-bikes become a better way to move around. So if you look at the industry today, most of the operators would offer 2-3 if not more form factors. All right. So those are the main technologies that have enabled the thrive of micromobility. So all of those technologies were not thought for micromobility itself. They were built for, or they were invented for other applications. But then with the growing need of a lightweight transportation, operators have kind of reuse those technologies to apply them to their use case. So small motors obviously were built for automobiles, and they have been repurposed for lightweight vehicles. Lithium batteries were primarily built for consumer electronics, laptops, smartphones, and then they were used for micromobility application, especially for electric bikes and scooters. GPS, of course, was something that has existed for decades and has been extremely beneficial for the industry. Same for smartphones and what we call market making software, which are basically the software that enables you to request a vehicle. Those were mainly democratized with Uber and Lyft, and then were repurposed with other operators like Bird and Lime. Let's talk about what are the challenges now that the industry is facing. Number one challenge, I was talking about it a bit before, is the unit economics. So how do you make it profitable? So what we've seen is that in the industry, at least until very recently, most of the operators were not able to break even on their operations. So if you look at the unit economics profile of a scooter sharing service, for instance, you'd see that the number one cost is the vehicle itself, and what conditionates the cost of the vehicle is, one, how much does it cost you to buy it or to build it, and two, how long does it last. What we saw is that the very first wave of scooter operators launched scooters that were not built for intensive use. They were not built for shared mobility. They were built for like a private consumer usage. So they were lasting on average 3 months. So there was no way for Bird or Lime or any other operator to make money because the lifespan of the scooters were way too short. So that's the number one cost, and we've seen a lot of improvements in that area with custom-made scooters that were built and designed for an intensive usage and a shared scheme. The second cost bucket is operations. So it's obviously very expensive and very complex to operate a large fleet of vehicles. One, you need to charge it on a regular basis. Two, you need to be able to repair them, and three, you need to be able to constantly reposition your fleet to make sure that they can attract as many users as possible and they can maximize their usage. So we've seen a lot of different models. So for instance, on the charging side of things, some operators would have swappable batteries, so they don't have to collect the vehicle every day and take it to their service centers to charge it. They just need to swap the batteries. Some other operators have chosen to stay with non-swappable batteries, so they'll have to recover most of the fleet every day to charge it. My experience is that swappable batteries are a lot more easier to operate, and they're also a lot more economical on the financial aspect. And the last one is obviously the last big cost or kind of cost bucket is the city fees, like permits. So more and more cities now are imposing fees for operators to launch their fleet, and that's related to my second point. Is one of the main challenges today for operators is to secure licenses to win tenders. So to give you an example, in Paris, before the city of Paris launched its tender, there were up to 15 operators at the same time, with no respect whatsoever of city rules on parking, road traffic. And after the Paris City Hall launched their tender, there were only 3 operators. So that was really a key thing for the operators that managed to win the tender. First, because they automatically eliminated more than 10 competitors, and two, because the supply was capped, so they were able to capture more rides and more users, as demand was still growing, whereas supply was stagnating at a fixed level. The third challenge is competition. There are obviously a lot of operators in the market. It's a highly competitive market, with, at least until very recently, most of the products or most of the services were very similar to each other. So the way to differentiate yourself from your neighbor was to reduce your cost, reducing your price for users. So that has been the case in many markets, especially in Western Europe. But today, what we see on the market is that there are lots of consolidations, with bigger players acquiring smaller players to make sure that they can get to scale faster on certain markets, and that they can keep prices at a higher level. The fourth big challenge is funding. There has been a lot of capital poured into the industry, with Bird and Lime raising hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. The problem today is that most investors are asking themselves, like, how is the industry going to get to profitability, and is using their capital for financing capex, financing vehicles, is a good use of their capital. So most big operators today are turning into new ways and new options of new financing options. So debt, asset-backed financing, having like special agreements with suppliers who would get a stake in the company. So there are many innovative ways to approach funding, and equity is no longer the only, or at least the unique way to fund your company. The last challenge is hardware. I was talking about it a bit before. So how do you think about your hardware? How do you make sure that you provide the best experience to your users, and you're able to build hardware that is built to last and doesn't break often? And what we've seen today is that if the operators at first would all go and buy hardware off the shelf from suppliers in Asia and China, today they're internalizing a lot more the whole design part of the hardware, which has become really the key to win the industry. So one last slide and one last word about like how the micromobility sector is impacted by the pandemic. So obviously in 2020, it has been a very bumpy year for all those companies. One, because most of the cities where they're operating were under lockdown, so there was less movement on the streets, obviously much less rides, and as it's extremely expensive to operate a large fleet, companies were losing a lot of money and suffering from the lack of activity, and also a lot of the users thought that shared transportation was coming with a health risk, because those vehicles were being touched by many people on the same day. So we've really seen a big dip in our activity. For instance, at Bird, last April, sorry, our activity decreased by 85%, which is a huge decrease. But the near future is a bit more rosy, with with more, we expect to see more and more people being reluctant to get on the subway, to get on public transport because of social distancing, and to turn to other ways of transportation. So shared mobility and scooter sharing, bike sharing is really perceived now as a healthier way to move around the city. Also, what we've seen is that cities are really doubling down on infrastructure, on subsidies, and trying to push hard to greener transportation, which also benefits the industry. All right, so I've been speaking for half an hour. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if you guys.
Alex had a question. Do you want to jump in, Alex?
Sure. Un très grand merci pour la présentation. Driss, we see here in LA a lot of interesting businesses that are trying to address micromobility solutions for last mile delivery, right? Whether you're talking about Amazon or UPS or others who say, we know it's long-term unsustainable to take so many packages into cities via, big vans. We know, it's going to need to be a smaller form factor. And we've seen some companies that have tried to sort of combine hardware, software, service solutions that somehow can meet the needs of both micromobility solutions for goods delivery and for people movement. I would just love to hear your perspective on where are the opportunities, where, as we know that scale can be sometimes hard to achieve to get to profitability in micromobility, where you see opportunities on things that sort of use goods movement plus people movement to reach scale, and where you're like, hey, don't try it in this part of the business. The customer needs are too differentiated.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Alex, for the question. I think there's a lot of synergies between let's say the B2C and B2B market. One on hardware and R&D. So what we see now in the goods delivery business in many cities, that more and more couriers and more delivery companies are leveraging the technologies that were made for people transportation to transport goods. So I'm thinking of, for instance, to cargo bikes. So cargo bikes are big e-bikes with like a load that you can carry. So you see those a lot more and more in the city. So you can really leverage all the R&D, all the work that has been done in developing great hardware for people moving to goods moving, and we see that more and more in the on the streets. The second one, and you're right, is on software. I think that with one of the things that really make this industry so interesting is the development of IoT, Internet of Things. There's so many great things that has been invented over the past few years on how to secure a bike, how to make sure that the bike is like in a great auto diagnostic of your bike, making sure that the bike receives great maintenance. And we see that those applications can be applied to people's or transportation for people, but also for goods. So you can really leverage this technology for all kind of transportation. The reality is that everything that at least all the infrastructure, all the subsidies that are initiated by cities, they also benefit to goods delivery. So for instance, the more and more bike lanes you have, the more and more the easier it's gonna be for couriers to move around the city. They can go faster to their destination. And there was a study that was made recently in Paris, is that they compared the efficiency of delivery with an e-bike versus a truck, like a cargo bike versus a truck, and they found out that like the cargo bike was delivering 20% more parcels than the truck, simply because they were going much faster and they were more nimble. So to answer your question, I think there are some really strong synergies between like people transportation and goods transportation.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else wants to hop in? Any questions? No? Shy crowd today.
Well, at the risk of dominating the conversation, I want to talk a little bit more about battery swap. Obviously in very heavy applications such as the four-wheeled automobile. It didn't work a decade ago with Better Place. It's beginning to work, it appears, with three-wheeler battery swap in India. I would just love to hear, what your current state of assessment is for both, for all micromobility form factors, where you see battery swap headed and what are some of the challenges, whether it's sort of converging on a standard between different players, et cetera. But would just, given that there's been such a mixed history around battery swap across, all vehicle types, would love to just hear your on the ground truth sensing about state of battery swap in Europe across different forms of micromobility.
Yeah. So I think one of the main challenges around battery swapping is that nobody today has been able to develop like a universal battery, like you can just swap across different vehicles. I think there are lots of companies working on this. There's a company in Taiwan called Kogoro who has developed like a very efficient way to swap batteries, and you can swap. They have both bikes and mopeds. Like you can swap batteries between those two vehicles form factors quite easily. Uber has also developed, or Lime today has also developed a quite efficient battery swapping system with the batteries that are common to their bikes and scooters. So my take on this is that we'll see more and more battery swapping stations in cities. The condition to that is that there are enough vehicles on the street to justify investment, because those are big investments for the cities that take space. So there has to be a lot more vehicles on the roads before cities commit to putting a lot of battery stations. But we should see a much denser network of battery swapping stations in big cities like Paris, London in the coming future. I'm not an expert on this subject. So at Bird, for instance, we've taken I think a decision that was maybe not the best, but to go without swappable batteries in our scooters. So we basically have to charge the whole vehicle. We have to recover the whole vehicle to charge it. Whereas competitors have developed like ways to have developed like a battery swapping technologies, which has proven to be a lot more efficient in terms of operations.
Awesome. I think Michael wanted to hop in as well.
Hey man, tell us about all these leasing companies that are coming online, like Swapfietsen has been around for a while in Europe, but like big SoundCloud guys, they've got, it's actually a lot of people from digital music who now want to lease people e-bikes, like the SoundCloud dudes with their dance thing. The Unagi guy in the US came from Beats, and then there's a few other people that are trying to that are coming from other directions and trying to lease e-bikes and scooters and mopeds and stuff to people. Like, where's that whole side of micromobility going, and who's going to win?
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting actually to see that those guys that come from the music industry. I think the music industry was the first industry, maybe with the movies one, to move from like an ownership to subscription model. So we really see a change of paradigm in those models. I think that more and more people are willing to pay for usage, and people don't want to own heavy vehicles. They don't want to bother with vehicles, so they'd rather just pay per ride or pay per usage, and I think this applies to mobility. What I see with those models is that they're really the best of both worlds between ownership and shared mobility. Owning an e-bike, so you were mentioning Swapfietsen and Dance, they do electric bike. Owning an e-bike, at least in Europe, is on average cost $2,000, so it's a pretty hefty cost. So there's a barrier to entry to access an e-bike. Then you need to deal with maintenance. You need to deal with insurance. There's a lot of theft. So, for instance, in France, in Paris, a bike gets stolen every 90 seconds. So it's a pretty high number. So ownership has a lot of friction, and then in front of that you have like shared mobility. But the problem with shared mobility is that it's also quite expensive. On average, a ride on a shared vehicle is $5 per ride. There's like some reliability issues. If you on average, one vehicle out of four is not in a working condition. So the subscription model whereby you get a bike which is yours 24/7, 7 days a week, but then whenever you're done using it, you can just return it to the provider. So it's a monthly subscription. There's no commitment. The provider sends you the bike. They take care of maintenance. They take care of insurance, and you don't have to care about repairing your bike. You don't have to care about like if the bike gets stolen. So I think the model is quite interesting, and I expect a lot of players to get into the game. I think that the unit economics for this model is much better than in the shared mobility one. First, because you don't need to charge the vehicles, and that's a pretty, and Michael, you know it better than me. It's a very high cost for operators. And second, because theft, at least in theory, the vehicles are less exposed to theft and vandalism, which is also a very high source of cost for operators. And last one is, I think the main difference in this model versus the shared mobility one is that people really feel a sense of responsibility and ownership with the vehicle. So they'll take a lot more care about the vehicle than they would if it would be just like a shared one. So I expect to see a lot of operators getting into that game, and probably and potentially the shared mobility operators would also look at it.
Do you think the music guys know what they're getting into? Are they ready for this? Like, do they like this? You know, actually, you probably have the best resume in micromobility, like of anyone, because of OFO and Scoot and Bird. Like, do you, like, as you're looking at these opportunities, do you think that folks that are coming from other industries know are going to be able to figure out all these challenges that you just laid out associated with, you know, sharing vehicles and renting vehicles and leasing vehicles and stuff?
Well, it's a great question. I think that there is a substantial it's a substantial operational challenge. I think it's a lesser challenge than the shared mobility one, simply because there's no repositioning of the fleet, there's no charging of the fleet, so that really lowers the operational burden on the operator. However, where I think the key to success in this specific segment will be the hardware. If you're able to build a hardware that lasts longer and that strikes a good balance between design and attractability, because people are making the arbitrage between buying their own bike or getting a subscription bike. So you need to find, your bike needs to be designed and it need to look good enough for someone to want to keep it at all times, but also it needs to be extremely durable and it needs to be extremely easy to repair. So I think designing the hardware will be key. And the second big part is, and I think that's where they'll be really good, is that user acquisition and product. I think they'll build a good product. It's a smart bike, so there's an app that comes with it. So if they're able to provide a great user experience, they have chances to make it successful.
Thanks.
Very interesting. Anyone else wants to? Oh, Jason, did you want?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for this overview. Really educational. My questions are more on sort of the business model itself. So you're talking about, you gave the example of an e-bike in Paris being about $2,000 if somebody were to buy it. That's a big hill for many people to climb. What are you thinking about for your subscription? Like, what would it convert into as a monthly basis then?
Yeah, so the idea behind the subscription is that you basically lower the access, the financial barrier to users. The way I'm thinking about pricing in my specific case is that I want to make it cheaper. I want to make it the cheapest transportation mode per ride. So for instance, in Paris, if you want to buy a public transport pass, it costs you about $70 bucks. So I'd be lower than that. So the sweet spot for me is between $60 and $70. Got
it. Cool. Thank you. And then just while I've got you, what about like insurance for the individual? Like, is that their responsibility in the way that you're looking at it, or is that something that you also have to cover? And then you talked a little bit about theft. You know, every 90 seconds in Paris, a bike is stolen. Can you talk a little bit more about the IoT approach and how you sort of minimize that as an issue, aside from, you know, the individual taking the bike into their house or their garage in the evening?
Yeah, on the insurance part, we basically work with insurers in Europe, and the contract is between the company, the provider, and the insurance. So the user does not appear personally on the contract. The bike is insured, not the user. In Europe, in France, and in most countries in Europe, 99% of the people are personally insured as a person. Whenever you have lodging, it means that you have personal insurance. So you don't need to insure the person; you just need to insure the hardware and the third party liability. So that comes with the contract. So that's the way we see insurance. Obviously, we want to lower the cost of insurance as much as possible, but we also want to make sure that the users feel responsible of the bike, that they just don't leave the bike in a like unsafe area, or they don't damage the bike. So there's also a waiver fee. So sorry, the word in English is, I think it's in French, is whenever you lose the vehicle, you still need to pay something. So we make sure that there is an amount of money that the user needs to pay in case they lose the vehicle, just to responsibilize the user. And on the second part of the question, how do we deal with theft? So there's many ways to do so. So every bike is equipped with a GPS tracker. So we're able to know where the bike is at all times. We have a mechanism of notifications when the bike gets stolen, gets moved, and you're not close to the bike, you get a notification on your phone. There's also an alarm. We ship every bike with an external lock. There's also a mechanical lock on the bike. So there are ways to prevent theft. So it's never 100% reliable and sure, but it makes it harder for the thief to rob it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Anyone else has any other questions for Driss while we have him here? If not, happy to give you back 15 minutes.
Right.
No?
Can we invest in Bloom or no? Like, are you not allowed to talk about that in this channel? It's probably too many. Probably SEC.
I'll send you the deck, Michael. we can talk about it offline. But yeah, I've actually just I'm in the process of raising some money, so let's talk about it.
All right. Driss, if you don't have the context, we were very, 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 very lucky to hire Driss at Scoot to run Spain and Latin America for us. And then shortly after that, we got acquired. And then Bird was very, 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 very lucky to get Driss to come run France for them. And then now whoever gets to invest in that startup is going to be very, very lucky. So I'm curious to see what happens to it.
I love
Michael.
it. But okay. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Driss, for this conversation. It was awesome.